So let's talk about some of the strongest and weakest armies in Warhammer 40k. Let's do a full game tier list and some of the best things that each army can put on the table. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd do a whole game tier list, talking through each army in Warhammer 40k and roughly how powerful I think they are right now. At time of recording, it hasn't really been so long since the latest 40k balance update, big changes from the latest points updates, a whole bunch of rules alterations, and a few recent codexes that haven't hit the meta so very long ago. And for this one I thought it could be fun to give a rough take as to which armies I think are going to be strongest and weakest going forward. As has tended to be the case in 10th edition, army performance and win rate differentials haven't really been too bad, at least at tournament level 40k. Most armies have typically been between the sort of 45 to 55% win rates. Maybe the most notable outliers were Sisters and Demons. In general though, game balance is definitely looking good relative to a lot of 40k's history. The vast majority of armies being able to play against each other, where the determining factors are likely to be player skill and list construction more so than just choosing the faction that's the most powerful. And while there's still some factions that need some help, some armies that are overtuned and plenty of stuff in the middle that could use various degrees of internal balance help, but broadly speaking for the average army playing against each other it's not really all that bad. This tier list is going to be a little bit of an early take after the balance update. There have been a bunch of interesting changes, and certainly towards the top end of Warhammer 40k, a lot of strong armies got nerfs of one degree or another. I'm sure a few of these rankings will turn out to be varying degrees of wrong. That seems kind of inevitable at this point. It'll be interesting to take a look at tournament stats when we get a little bit more data and see what actually winds up standing on top. Overall though for this one, I've ranked the 40k armies into 5 main tiers, plus one S tier army sticking out the top a bit. With all the usual caveats to 40k tier lists, they are really quite arbitrary. It varies a lot depending on how you play the army and whether you're playing casual, competitive and all sorts of other factors, and maybe it's just more of a helpful way to chat about faction balance more so than anything else. All that being said though, let's jump straight into it, and starting off with tier 5 we've got the single army that I'd rate as having bigger issues than any other army out there, and of course that's Imperial Agents, seemingly doomed to stay in this spot unless Games Workshop feel like putting a bit more thought into them. In general, they've been an army that's been near enough unplayed in competitive games since their release. Over the last 3 months or so, there's been around about 20-ish people who have taken them to grand tournaments. They probably haven't done too badly as a small cohort, doing Imperialis fleet things with board control tricks, but certainly not enough data to claim them being good or anything like that. And I feel like the more telling thing is the fact that just basically no one's playing them. Their core mechanics is an allied one, more focused around adding their units to other armies rather than playing them themselves, although I guess they do have one faction special rule in swapping out the assassins for each other to tailor them to an opponent. Their strong options to put on the table are a bit limited. People tend to use Imperialis fleets and do navy units doing board control style things with their movement shenanigans that they can do there. Kyriadraxus might often feature hiding some units from view. The assassins are fairly efficient, particularly with being able to tailor to the exact right one. And then if you actually want to deal some damage to some tough stuff, it tends to be some combination of Deathwatch, Grey Knight Terminators, or Allied Knights, maybe some Armigers. But in general it's one big weakness of the codex that they just don't really have that great mainline damage dealers that can pose a really serious threat to tough things like tanks and vehicles. Feels like it really wouldn't be too hard for Games Workshop to make them a fair bit more playable. The most obvious one giving them an army rule, probably something that helps them out against tough stuff, or perhaps find a more convincing way to add some anti-armor units into the mix. And given that Imperialis fleet seems to be the only one being played, that kind of implies that the other ones are super weak. Games Workshop haven't helped them out with several balance updates so far, and there's a good chance they might not if they continue like this. Maybe they're just meant to be the fun and fluff faction and provide some allies for other Imperial stuff, or a challenge for people wanting to win Warhammer 40k on hard mode. Moving on from the Imperial Agents though, the more established factions in Warhammer 40k that are ranked towards the lower end of the pack at the moment will be these ones, and that's the Black Templars, Adepta Sororitas and the Adeptus Mechanicus. I would certainly caveat that by saying that even these ones aren't really all that bad at the moment, and certainly not in the hands of a skilled player that knows the army well. And I think it more says something about 40k in general at the moment, that these are still playable to some degree at least, though I do feel like they're probably a bit more of an uphill struggle at the moment compared with a bunch of other factions out there, and certainly against the things that seem to be pushing their way towards the top of the meta. Going through those, and first up we have the Black Templars, who've really had a bit of a slow decline over the course of 10th edition really. Prior to the update, their tournament win rates were 44% for the Knights of Sigismund, fighting them with the Space Marine datasheets with the addition of their own unique ones, with their Sword Brethren Crusader squads and unique characters. For their core mechanics, they use the Oath of Moment for the big targeted damage buff with just the reroll hits now. None of the Divergent chapters are able to use the +1 to wound anymore. And then their Righteous Crusader detachment, which very much tends to be the dominant one for people playing them when they're trying to make them strong. That allows you to pick some vows either for extra feel no pain durability or a bunch of extra damage. For From the latest balance change, the only real thing that changed for them were the Space Marine points nerfs. I guess maybe cheaper Blade Guard veterans could help them out a bit, though I feel like they're definitely competing for the same role as Sword Brethren, so maybe having two units that are both fairly good in the same sort of role doesn't help so much. The Space Marine changes beyond that broadly weren't too helpful for a bit of fire support though if you're using some gun tanks or dreadnoughts. In any case, for stronger options at the moment, as mentioned, they tend to use their Righteous Crusaders detachment rather than the ones from the core codex. That gives you some feel no pain and has some good enhancements like the boosted one for 10 Houses Bones, plus some nice melee tricks like extra AP or locking things in combat. For their unique units, I'd say pretty much all of them are interesting enough in their own way, but just not really quite as standout as they used to be. Sword Brethren and Hellbrets can make a nasty mess of virtually anything in Warhammer 40k still with their sheer damage output, but they will be paying a lot more points than they used to be for that privilege. You can still make a Crusader squad pretty tanky with a 5+ feel no pain. I've seen some people using them in 10s. The bigger squads costing more is a bit on the painful side though, and their impulses with multi-melters can be nice enough to get Sword Brethren where they want to go. The 5+10 Houses Bones can be interesting on the Assault Terminators as well with a bunch of Thunder Hammers, and they quite like the flexing into anti-psyker special rule if they're able to do that. Overall though, it doesn't really seem to have been coming together for them on the tournament performance. Prior to the balance update, and given some Space Marine nerfs, it doesn't really look like it's going to improve from that. Feels like a few of their units could have just used some positive points changes. There's nothing really wrong with the datasheets, but the points have just crept up after a bunch of balance updates so far in 10th. I guess they'll also have their codex changing things not so very long in the future. Next up for armies I've mentioned down here are the Adepta Sororitas. By the numbers, they were pretty much the weakest faction in game prior to the points updates, a 42% win rate, and not really many people choosing to play them after a fairly horrendous double nerf over the past 2 updates before that, taking a strong codex and then making all the units really quite expensive. That got them to a fairly balanced place, and then they had a whole bunch of rules nerfs follow that, with loads of things for Bringers of Flame in particular. For their core mechanics, they have their Acts of Faith and Miracle Dice, certainly powerful dice manipulation in 40k, particularly if you can rustle up some 6s, feeding them into automatic massive multi-melter damage or similar. Plenty of good ways to get value between saves, advanced rolls, and datasheet abilities for the low ones. They also get a bunch of 6+ invulnerable saves due to their faith across the faction as well. The last balance changes were certainly positive for them. They had points drops to their jump pack units, Repentia, Celestian Sacrosancts, and a few others like the Arcoflagellants and the Dominions. And while their Miracle Dice mechanic wasn't restored to what it was prior to the nerfs, at least now you get one for each Destroyed Sisters unit, as opposed to having it capped 1 per phase, and that does mean that they should have a few more to access, but generally only slightly later in the game after you've taken some heavy casualties. I feel like the changes as they've happened probably won't change too much, from Hallowed Martyrs perhaps being the single strongest attachment. I guess Repentia and Arcoflagellants could help Penitent Host slightly, and very cheap Sacrosancts in 10s could be alright for Champions of Faith. They look at least a fairly well-rounded unit on paper for that 130 points now. Hallowed Martyrs just adds a lot of value with character things, some Miracle Dice generation, and being able to resurrect Morven Val from death is particularly nice, and also that stratagem that stops enemies from targeting you in melee if you've got one sacrificial unit on standby. Most of the datasheets do seem playable enough in the right detachment. Maybe some standout things feel like their Val Paragons, the Palatine with the lethal hits, and some cool damage combos, Seraphim and Ice for actions, objectives, and move, shoot, move. And regular Battle Sisters pretty efficient when split by an Immolator for their sticky objectives and Miracle Dice farming. A lot of the rest might be determined by detachments. I feel like the points and Miracle Dice changes were a solid push in the right direction, though still not really going to be enough to get them out of the lower tier of Warhammer 40k. They just feel a little bit light touch for just how overshadowed they were previously. I'd guess it'd probably be enough for them not to be the single standout worst army like they were before though I suspect they'll probably be in a position where they're still wanting more to happen for them next time around. Next up, we've got the Soldiers of the Machine God of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Pre-tournament win rates around about 45% at grand tournaments, and make in general not a particularly well-played army with lots of people picking them up. It seems like they start off with okay win rates after Christmas, but then slowly drifted down. For their core gameplay things, they get a lot of bionics with 5+ invulnerable saves on a lot of their infantry. And then they have the big choice of the Doctriner Imperatives, allowing you to go Protector or Conqueror each turn, give you big boost to damage either to static firepower or advance and shoot with better weapon skill in melee and things. Maybe Conqueror feels a bit more standout for me for most armies, though at any given turn it might not always be the one that you want. The latest balance update was kind of light touch. Belisarius Call dropped a bit, going down to 135 points, and he looks like a far more interesting choice at that, and the Tech Priest Dominus dropping down to 65 points, which I think isn't unhelpful, but not necessarily going to tip the balance as to whether or not he's the best choice over something like the Manipulus, depending on what you were using already. For their stronger choices at the moment, Competitive lists seem to be either playing the Halo Screed Grotmus detachment or the Skitarii Hunter cohort. The Halo Screed one I did think was quite a fun one, with Tech Priest asserting control from afar and being quite a general purpose detachment that's got some good stuff for a whole bunch of elements of the army, not just the Skitarii. Cataphront Breachers can shoot really hard in it, and there's quite a nice enhancement for the Castellan robots, and there's some good stratagem support for the Halo units too. The Hunter cohort makes Skitarii harder to kill, has some nice movement shenanigans with them, and some flat extra damage and defense, plus some fairly good enhancements for Skitarii Marshals. Maybe for standout units in general, the Skitarii troops are almost always going to be there in big numbers for buffing other datasheets, maybe even more so in Hunter cohort than Halo Screed. Scorpius Disintegrators are maybe one of the more efficient anti-tank platforms that they've got. Taraxian Infiltrators can be nice for screening and scoring, and Rust Stalkers and Chicken Walkers of both varieties can be fairly dangerous units in most detachments that they play in. For the Halo Screed ones, maybe Castellan Breachers tend to be a bit more of a focal unit with character buffs and enhancements, and Castellan Robots can get the Datasmith enhancement, and then for Hunter cohort it's more Skitarii with some Marshals and doubling down on all the efficient units they've got already. I still feel like overall they're maybe not the easiest army to play, and still lacking for a little bit of raw power for the points currently. In any case, it doesn't really seem that they've had very much tournament success whatsoever in quite a long time, fairly middling win rates and not really tending to win many if any events. Before we move on to the next tier, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, one option for magnetic storage for your miniatures to get them from A to B in safety. These cases are made by Sam based in West Virginia in the USA, and one custom option for magnetic storage, something that's been quite a big trend in recent Warhammer 40k storage, attaching magnets to the bases of your miniatures so they don't slide around when they're in transit. The Tabletop Stronghold cases are made of very sturdy MDF, notably hard to break or damage, and then within them they've got a bunch of different layers of steel sheets, places where the miniatures that you can sit, and there's different layers that you can put them in so you can raise or lower the heights depending on what you're transporting. They also feature a pretty nice acrylic sheet on the front as well, so you can see what goes where when you're transporting them. Always nice to have miniatures nice and visible while they're being stored, and broadly speaking I've generally seen very positive reports on Reddit and people very happy with their purchases. Seems like general opinion has been that the cases are pretty well made. They do also have some MDF terrain on sale as well, with this competitive terrain set, which can be a touch cheaper if bought with one of the cases. But in any case, feel free to check them out, links down in the video description if you'd like to take a look over their range. At the moment they've got a 25% off sale for their spring sale, so things are a little bit cheaper than their rope prices normally. And if you're interested in their stuff, I'll cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through their range briefly. In any case, a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Moving on in the tier list of 40k armies though, in tier 3 these are the armies I consider maybe a little bit lower mid right now. Again, I'd probably rate them as just a little bit harder to win with than some, but absolutely not impossible. As mentioned, Warhammer 40k in general is really well balanced, and good armies of these played well can absolutely take down some of the top stuff in the game. First up we've got the Dark Eldar in the Drukhari. Pre-updates their win rates were around about 48%, so doing sort of middling within 40k on that metric. They're maybe a bit propped up by their Reaper's Wager allied Grotmus attachment, which does feel a bit strange for it being such a focal one for them, given it's their allied one with the Harlequins. Their core mechanics have them moving really quickly around the board, often jumping out of their iconic Raider and Venom transports, and then getting power-ups and pain tokens, farming them when units fail battle shock or die, and then plugging them into extra damage, extra movement, and extra AP and melee as well. Their latest balance changes were also kind of small. Cheaper Witches and Cabalite Warriors probably aren't going to be massively changing the fortunes of the faction, though I'd say they're both helpful enough changes. They do tend to get played in a lot of army lists, Witches with Lilith Hesperex and Cabalite Warriors in Venoms and things to grab objectives. For detachment choice, they currently have 3, and it's the Reaper's Wager with the Harlequins and lots of options for getting scary Drukhari melee where it needs to be, and the option for some big rerolls if you keep on flipping the Wager back to Drukhari, and then the Sky Splinter Assault transport focus one, which can give you some damage boosts after disembarking, in particular Lance melee and some really long charges with things like Archons and Incubi. Most datasheets in the army are at least fairly usable. Maybe some other standout ones could be some Mandrakes to screen the midboard and then fade away doing objectives. A Beastmaster scouting to block enemy movement lanes can be nice. Scourges cost a lot but can inflict some nasty damage output from safety, and the Talos and Kronos are both really efficient as well. Talos just being fairly solid all round for damage and defense, and Kronos almost always worth having at least one of for farming some pain tokens. Pretty much the entire army is at least okay though. Overall at the moment I'd say they're at least fairly well balanced, maybe just lacking a little bit on the sheer value side that a few of the armies that have ranked above might be able to exert some easy power with. Otherwise for faction design, maybe being reliant on their allied detachment for a good chunk of their performance isn't particularly ideal, and just for their army in general they're waiting for a refresh on a whole bunch of their kits. Not exactly very helpful for collectors trying to put some of their units on the tabletop. Next up, we've got the Legion of Tzeentch in the Thousand Suns. Pre-updates, they were winning around about 51% of tournament games, though have been kind of rarely played recently. Their core rules revolve around Kabbalistic rituals, dealing psychic damage with sorcerers, and lots of character focus. In the latest balance update, they had some internal balance changes, a slightly pricey Mutalith Vortex Beast, which lots of people were taking but it didn't go up very much. Some tanks got pricier that nobody was using that much. A Scarab of Cult Terminators, their attached sorcerer, and some big squads of their chaff got a bit cheaper. For competitive armies trying to do well, they were generally using the Cult of Magic, the more standard psychic damage one from the Index as opposed to the board control Hex Warp Thrallband. Nice extra psychic damage and a few good enhancements like doubling up on rituals and being able to teleport stuff across the board. Lists have tended to be fairly cookie cutter for a while now, Magnus leading the way, usually backed up by Ahriman and a good cast of sorcerers and infernal masters, usually leading small rubric squads to farm up those Cabal points. A Mutalith Vortex Beast or two, and then some units of chaff like Cultists or Zangor Enlightened to do some screening and scoring shenanigans. At the moment they still do seem to be an army that can still do well in tournaments, their win rates aren't too bad or anything like that, but are maybe a little bit mono-build in their playstyle, and I feel like quite a high-skill army to use with some big decisions to make about things like their Kabbalistic rituals, and how to manage Magnus, both are getting good value out of him while not getting him killed quite so easily. Not all that many people seem to be choosing to put them on the table in any case compared with some other times in 40k. I guess things will change in quite a big way in the near future for them with their codex, likely with a whole load of different options with detachments and maybe some new units too. Next up, we've got the fancy battlesuits and big guns of the Tau Empire. Pre-balance updates, they were winning around about 46% worth of tournament games, generally functioning as a mobile gun line with a fair bit of synergy between their different units, with things having to work in pairs to maximise firepower with for the greater good, particularly with stealth suits for reroll ones to hit and wounds. The balance updates had some small changes for them. Krutox Rampagers feel like a fairly standout unit for their stats for the cost now at just 85 points for 3 of them. The Lone Spear is even cheaper for the Kroot-relevant detachments, and then they got their experimental prototype cadre with the Borkhan-style extra long range and a few interesting damage stratagems. For quite a while now, the Tau Empire seem to have been one of the armies that have had some of the best splits and genuine interest to using really quite a lot of their detachments without just having one of them dominate, which is quite nice. I'm guessing that the experimental weapon cadre will probably just be one of those extra options that people do choose to use, but probably not excessively good compared with the rest at first impressions. And in general for their units, they've got a fairly good balance with most things being able to be played in their own detachments. Some things are just kind of needed, like the stealth suits. Crisis suit combos with commanders tend to be staples in most detachments. Devilfish breaches are quite nice in Montcar and Khao Yon, and a fair amount of their big stuff is viable in the right detachment. The tanks, the Riptides, Ghost Kills with their lone operative protection, and broadsides with some big hitting rail rifles are all very nice. Shadow Suns are usable and scary lone operative. And for the Kroot things, Carnivores can be nice enough for sticky objectives. The Rampagers are just fairly big hitting countercharge now, and Vespids can be good for jumping on and off the board. Pretty much the entire codex is usable to some extent or another. It just seems that for Tau in general, their win rates tend to be a little bit on the lower side of 40k at the moment versus the majority. But maybe not really quite so bad that they're in clear desperate need of help compared with some of the other factions. For army weaknesses, they generally tend to trade off with their range and shooting damage output without being quite so tough for the majority of their units. They can sometimes be a harder army to play than most, having ranged firepower but also needing to push up and take those mid-board objectives. The faction mechanic can sometimes be a little bit painful to optimise. If certain things start getting killed, and suddenly damage output might drop off a bit. A Retaliation cadre in particular did used to be one of their strongest detachments, and people haven't seemed to have been finding quite the same sort of success with it after the 3-inch Deep Strike got nerfed. I feel like overall they're not in the worst place for 40k factions, but maybe a tiny bit more lower mid compared with some. Moving onwards and upwards though, next up for the armies that are ranked in Tier 2, I split Tier 2 into two halves, this one being the slightly lower one but not by too much, and then there's really quite a lot of armies in the upper one this time around. By this point though, all these are pretty strong and scary armies in the right hands. Here I've chosen to rank Chaos Knights, Grey Knights, Dark Angels and Space Wolves. Jumping straight into these ones, and first up we've got Grey Knights. Pre-update tournament win rates are around about 50%, and the Knights of Titan in 10th edition tend to function with their teleport tactics, units warping on and off the board, and generally having close range damage output with their Psy Cannons and some fairly general purpose Nemesis force weapon close combat. The latest balance update didn't really change too much for them, the Purgation squads losing their rerolls in the Warpbane task force, and their Interceptors went down a little bit, only by 5 points, but they were fairly efficient already. Detachments wise, since they nerfed the 3-inch Deep Strikes and Armour of Contempt, and Warpbane came along with its big hitting rerolls, generally people have been choosing Warpbane over the Teleport Force, and there's quite a few lists that seem at least fairly cookie cutter, usually something like 3 or 4 Dread Knights, including the big ones like their Grandmasters. handling a bit of anti-tank with some psi cannons and some punchy great hammers to take down tough stuff in close combat. Khaldor Drago getting some Terminators into the fray from Deep Strike is a bit of a staple. Purifiers generally tend to be on the board for the Warpbane task force as they project the aura rerolls and have some nice stratagems, and often backed up by at least some strike squads and interceptors for sticky objectives and a bit of fast moving. Overall, I feel like the balance changes didn't really hurt them too badly. Their teleport tricks give them some massive mobility and getting forces exactly where they need to be, though it isn't exactly a silver bullet, as might not necessarily help them get into close combat or to hold objectives and things. It can be a bit worse against armies that can screen out large sections of the board really easily, and still maybe have the problem that outside of Dread Knights they don't have as much stuff to take down really tough monsters and vehicles. In any case, probably won't be too long till their codex comes out, and likely gives them a few different ways to play with new detachments. Next up for the Chaos Knights, they've had win rates previously of 48% or so. As usual with Knights of all descriptions, big stat check armies like these tend to do better at the sort of more RTT and casual level as opposed to tops of grand tournaments, though it's not like they can't win at the top level as well. For their core army mechanics, they're a whole army worth of big stompy walkers with good defensive profiles and scary damage stat lines, invulnerable saves at range, and the Chaos Knights, both the big ones can smash through terrain pieces and the small ones can also use their walk through wall stratagem, meaning that they can be hard to screen out and not get caught behind terrain. And then their army rules tend to revolve around Battle Shock and Dread range and things, more likely to test Battle Shock if your units have even taken a bit of damage, which can occasionally cost victory points, and then potentially some damage and defensive boosts for the unlucky units that succumb to it. For the last balance changes, they just had a few points drops to Big Knights, Desecrators and Despoilers and Tyrants going down, but not really by a huge amount. And they'd be affected by the Demons changes as well, with quite a lot of their datasheets being rewritten in one way or another. For optimised lists out there at the moment, basically everyone's using the standard Traitorous Lance. Unfortunately, the ones where you feed the cultists into the Gatling guns hasn't taken off quite so much. And despite the sheer amount of balance passes that Games Workshop's done in 10th edition so far, it still seems that War Dog spam is absolutely the way to go on the competitive level. Lots of lists still going for the tried and tested Brigand and Carnivore spam, maybe with a Stalker to bear the Warlord trait, some lists going for one Titanic one Knight of one sort or another, and a fair few Titanic ones are usable enough for that role. If anything, more common than the Titanic Knights seems to be some allied demons to have along, Plague Bearers for sticky objectives, Nurglings for certain secondaries and infiltrates. Beasts of Nurgle are looking extra nice now that they can get Scout if you've got one of the former, and occasionally perhaps some others like Great Unclean Ones or Rottagus. Overall, still doesn't really look like anything is going to change too much for them before they finally get their codex. It does just seem a bit of a weird decision that Games Workshop's had that War Dog spam has just decided to be the order of the day for 10th edition, even if it's kind of clearly not what the majority of Chaos Knight collectors want to be playing most of the time. Otherwise, for army issues, skew lists like Knights might tend to have a few more issues than some. Big stat check things that can be a little bit more obvious in the way that they play maybe, and excessive big anti-tank damage output being a problem, though perhaps being one of the armies that can muster a fair bit of indirect fire with their Havoc launchers isn't too bad into certain matchups like Aeldari. Next up, we've got the Unforgiven forces of the Dark Angels, again pre-update win rates around about 48% or so. They used the Core Space Marine Oath of Moment to really punish one unit with their damage output, and then besides that they mainly have their Deathwing and Ravenwing themes in the army. Interesting stuff revolving around Terminators and their elites, or their biker units in the right detachments. For the last balance update, they didn't really get anything specific to Dark Angels. The Space Marine points changes with some nerfs to firepower units, and maybe the Stormlance reactive move stratagem being nerfed a bit was more relevant for them than most. You can't use it to reactive move Lionel Johnson anymore, which was a pretty interesting option given just how threatening a miniature he is. For their detachments, the majority of lists seem to be using Stormlance or Gladius as their go-to detachments now. They can both advance and charge and get scary units like the Inner Circle Companions and Deathwing Knights exactly where they need to be and into the targets that they want to. Gladius has a fair bit of other interesting stuff going for it, and Stormlance can help out their biker units along the way. For their Codex detachments, it seems that Company of Hunters is doing alright for the few people trying it. The Ravenwing detachment for a bit of shooting support and delivering biker units to big alpha strikes. Otherwise, besides their fighting elite with the Inner Circle Companions, maybe Judiciars or Librarians to lead them, and the Deathwing Knights. Grandmaster Azrael tends to be an auto-include as well, farming command points and then giving some helpful damage buffs to his units. He potentially could be interesting with Assault Intercessors, though works with lots of stuff. The Lion himself is playable, even if he did go up a bit in points last time around. And Samael, the master of the Raven Wing, alongside some Outriders, can hit really quite hard. He did quite enjoy the change that they got, where they get to hit with +1 damage, which applies to Samael's sword as well. Overall, it mainly feels like their unique units aren't in the worst place in the world, but I think since a long time they really could have used something to help them make good use of their own unique detachments, things like the new Lion's Blade one, the Unforgiven Task Force, and the Deathwing formation. It's still just a little bit disappointing to see them basically having to use the Gladius and Stormlance as their strongest options, when they've got quite a lot of fun flavourful ones on offer that just don't really seem to hold up to the same level of strength. Finally, for the armies that are put in this tier, we've got their rivals in the Space Wolves. Again, similar sort of middle tier kind of win rates. 47% prior to the balance update, and didn't really change all that much in the balance pass, bar the nerfs to some Space Marine firepower and a couple of other things. Their core mechanic again is the Oath of Moment, and beyond that they're a melee focused chapter where their most played unique detachment is the Champions of Rust, the character themed one where you start with one saga active, and then you've got the possibility to activate some more if your characters can do some great deeds, and then they've got stratagems that might become yet more effective as more sagas happen. For detachments that they get played with at the moment, that Champions of Rust one does well, and otherwise the other focus one for them tends to be the Stormlance Task Force, given that that helps mounted units, and Thunderwolves are a big tough, fast and fighty melee units that can really use those buffs. It not being uncommon for lists like that to use 3 maxed out squads of 6 Thunderwolves with maximal characters attached to them, charge forward with a massive amount of threat and good durability, particularly with that anti-shooting stratagem that they have, and the other good damage defense and speed boost that gives you. They're maybe the single most focal Space Wolf unit at the moment. The Wolfen are still a really quite efficient datasheet though, with their main downside of not having objective control. Logan Grimnar's often on the tabletop, given that he gives you some army-wide rerolls, which gives you a big bonus on top of his datasheets. Ragnar Blackmane's a pretty punchy melee character, and sometimes the Dreadnoughts get used like Bjorn the Fell-Handed or maybe Murderfang. Overall I feel like they're in an alright enough place. 2 viable detachments and their most exciting melee units doing well. Maybe some of their more core things like the Bloodclaws and Grey Hunters tend to take a bit of a backseat, at least in the most competitive games. Might be nice to see a little bit of love for them. And I guess for really heavy Thunderwolf lists, they might just be a tiny bit obvious with what they're going to do moving forward and trying to press back in your own deployment zone. Certain armies might have alright counters for that. As an army, I feel like there's maybe a little bit of low sentiment towards starting a new army of them right now with a probable Primaris update in the works. Feels like Games Workshop has been hinting that way towards most of 10th edition, and it's maybe a bit uncertain exactly what units are going to remain in their current form after the update. There's a good chance a lot could get sent to Legends or get shiny new updates. I feel like that's maybe one of the contributing factors towards people not wanting to put competitive armies of them on the table quite as much as some. Perhaps in combo with the faction of Thunderwolf spam being something that takes a bit of time to build up. Moving on though, and here's the upper half of the armies that I ranked in tier 2. As you can see, there's an enormous amount of factions here. These are ones I broadly expect to be placing somewhere around the sort of 50 to 51% win rate kind of mark and taking some tops of grand tournaments. Generally fairly well balanced factions, at least against the competition. And they've all got some seriously scary stuff to put on the table, and with their top builds played well, feel like fairly formidable adversaries on the table in one way or another. Here I've chosen to rank Genestealer Cults, Blood Angels, Necrons, Death Guard Tyranids, Astra Militarum, Adeptus Custodes, Chaos Space Marines, Leagues of Votann, World Eaters, and perhaps potentially the new Emperor's Children, though it sounds like it'll be at least a little while before they start to hit tournaments properly. Going through those, and first up we have the Genestealer Cults. They had pre-update win rates for around about 50%. Seems like they've ping-ponged between being one of the strongest armies in the game and one of the weakest, though aren't in a bad spot right now. And they're doing their normal steaky things with their core mechanics of whole army deep strikes if you want it for the infantry. Cult Ambush to have injured models returned to the board, now capped at a certain amount. And plenty of the detachments having various interesting guerrilla warfare style tricks. They didn't really get any changes pretty much in the balance update, only one singular nerf to 20 strong neophytes, which went up from 130 to 145, and that felt like a nerf that maybe hit the Host of Ascension a fair bit more than some of the others. For detachments being played prior to the update, it was Biosantic Broodsurge, Host of Ascension and Final Day that were the most common. Interesting to see some good use and success of the allied Tyranid one. That allows you to field the Tyranid Vanguard invaders and have some nice benefits from fighting alongside. Otherwise, Biosanctic Broodsurge is the melee one, where they go heavy on the pure strains and the aberrants and biophaguses with things like metamorphs, and generally do excess melee damage and easy ways to get into combat. Host of Ascension being the one for jumping in and out of reserve and hitting the enemy really hard on the alpha strike. Maybe 20 strong neophyte blocks alongside a Primus or Benefactors being a staple unit there. I feel like a lot of their damage dealers are fairly detachment dependent. But beyond that, Achilles Ridge Runners are pretty much a staple for the extra AP that they can provide, just helping out anything. And both types of Acolytes often tend to come up in a lot of lists. Nice damage output for the Flamer ones and being a cheap Deep Striker style unit, and the other ones being able to farm command points as well as doing some countercharge things. They've got some fairly nice, cheap and efficient lone operatives as well, which are nice for utility, and their transport vehicles are usable enough too. In general, Genestealer Cults tend to be regarded as one of the armies that's maybe a little bit trickier to play in 40k. Units maybe being a little bit on the fragile side for the points cost, and relying on getting first strikes and damaging important enemy stuff, and playing missions rather intelligently compared with certain armies, and maybe a few big decisions with what happens with using your Cult ambush reserves. But overall it does seem to be coming together for them fairly well. A pretty powerful and fun army with a few different detachments. It'll be interesting to see if Final Day is still going to be one of the stronger detachments to play with all the allied Tyranid lone operatives. Next up we've got the Blood Angels. Tournament win rates are around 51% prior to the update, again getting the big hitting Space Marine Oath of Moment, and generally being a fairly ferocious and hard hitting army of fast moving infantry with jump packs, most of their detachments being able to advance and charge. The last balance update once again nerfed some Space Marine things, and I feel like that was kind of relevant for them, seeing as quite a lot of Blood Angels armies tended to be going for a good amount of melee stuff backed up by some scary gun tanks like Vindicators or maybe Ballistus Dreads. A fair few people were making use of these slightly odd rules where if you took no Blood Angels datasheets they could get boosted Oath of Moment, so I guess that was a nerf for anyone using them that way. Rage Fueled Warrior for the Liberator Assault group went up, but they did have some good news as well, with Blade Guard Veterans going down to 80 points, and giving Blood Angels yet another fairly scary melee assault unit, and a bunch of cuts to the Death Company on foot. For detachments being played, the Liberator Assault group is certainly still the most common by a very long way. Advance and charge, massive melee damage with +2 strength and extra attacks, Red Rampage and scary enhancements like Rage Fueled Warrior comboed with a Captain. The Angelic Inheritors is also doing rather well too though. That's the character one that can also be kind of oddly good for certain shooting unit combos too, but also has some pretty cool and powerful stratagems for character-led units. For units that tend to be standout for them, Sanguinary Guard, maybe being led by Dante, are a staple in just about every single list. They've just got really efficient damage profiles and fairly good defense for fast-moving jump infantry too. Jump Death Company are really scary, likely with Lamartes for his -1 damage and his lethal hits. Both the Sanguinor and Mephiston are really interesting lone operatives with some big melee threat and fights first. Captains are often taken to the table, leading assault intercessors, where a unit of them can hit very, very hard, particularly if you go for Red Rampage. And basically any Space Marine melee units can punch up a lot harder than you'd expect. Anything with strength for a bunch of attacks and AP -1 is fairly fair game for wiping out lighter infantry. Things like jump intercessors, scouts, or incursors and things, they can all get rather next level for the melee damage in Blood Angels. For downsides, it does feel like they've taken a few nerfs, especially in big firepower things like Vindicators and Predators were notable, as was the Rage Fueled Warrior increase, and the sort of Bloodless Angels thing being one way that they were doing well. But the core of what they do hasn't really changed too much, and Better Blade Guard could certainly be another interesting option. It can be an army that needs a fair bit of thought though, and some big commitments with some scary melee units, needing to know when best to engage and throw their things into the fray, and when they need to play KG and eke out mission points. Next up we've got the Necrons, who might have been one of the single armies that I was most tempted to put up in tier 1 compared with the armies in this tier. I could have either happily ranked them at low tier 1 or high tier 2. Pre-update, they had overall win rates of around about 52%, though higher than that with their Star Shatter arsenal. And they've got quite a varied unit roster with a bunch of really quite differently operating units, though all of them tend to grow back wounds when they're being damaged with their reanimation protocols, which can mess with enemy firepower, particularly with big tough tanky things like Votann. The only change that they had in the recent balance update was a small nerf to Doomsday Arcs going up 10 points. That is meaningful given that lots of good lists were spamming 2 or 3 of them. But it still doesn't change that they're a very good unit even at 200. As mentioned, Star Shatter seems to have been the most played recently, with its big damage against things on objectives, and particularly helping out the Silent King and the scary Doomsday Arcs. Otherwise, Awakened Dynasty with its character leader combos, and some pretty powerful and interesting stratagems, plus the Hypercrypts with teleporting Necrons warping around the board to shoot stuff and take objectives. Both of those are also really quite solid. For datasheets, I'd rate the vast majority of the Necron Codex as being really quite playable in-game. Perhaps to look at highlights, the C'tan remain really quite terrifying and are really a terrible choice to put in an army list, particularly the Nightbringer and Void Dragon. They've got loads of strong options for cheap interference and secondary units, things like Flayed Ones, Ophidian Destroyers, Death Marks, Scarabs, Single Locust Destroyers and more. As mentioned, the Silent King and Doomsday Arcs and the Canoptek Reanimator to support them, perhaps really like Starshatter, maybe some Hexmark Destroyers to bear enhancements, and Imitate the Stormlord is a fairly easy include for a fair amount of lists, generating extra command points to throw into powerful stratagems for multiple armies. Overall, they're certainly still in a pretty strong place and haven't really changed too much despite a small nerf. Feels like it might not be the worst thing in the world for the faction if they manage to change them a little bit to be a bit more focused on the sort of battle line and big unit combos. Squads with leader combos just don't really seem to be quite as much of a thing compared with the past for Necrons. I guess perhaps Awakened Dynasty and Hypercrypt incentivise them a bit more than Starshatter though. Next up, we've got the Pestilent Forces of the Death Guard. Pre-update win rates are around about 51%, and the Plague Legions of Nurgle generally have big sturdy Space Marines with boosted toughness stats, spewing out contagions of Nurgle to anything nearby, making enemies easier to kill with -1 toughness, often extra AP or -1s to hit as well on top of that. They also get their infected objective markers, and quite a lot of their units have plague weapons with lethal hits on them, maybe allowing them to punch up and deal a bit of chip attrition damage even against tough stuff with most units that they have. In the last balance update, they didn't really have too many changes. Their Predators increased a bit, the Blight Haulers dropped a touch, and Nurgle Demons had a few side grades. Nurglings getting a bit cheaper but not having quite as good a debuff rule. In general, for strong armies, people tend to use the Plague Company as opposed to the Flyblown Host. The extra contagion boost of either extra AP or -1 to hits tends to have a fair bit of value. Sustained hits in melee isn't bad, even if I'd rate maybe a few of the other options just a bit mid compared with some detachments out there in 40k. For strong units, there do tend to be a fair few staples. Deathshroud Terminators with their big size might move very slowly, but they do come with incredibly intimidating stats for their cost. Typhus feels borderline auto-includes between similar kind of stats and some mortal wounds. Plague Marines alongside Biologist Putrefiers jumping out of Rhinos are a really scary melee threat. Bloat Drones and Blight Haulers are both really efficient and cheap little demon engines. The Predator tanks have been a staple as well, though I feel like with the nerfs, the edge has been taken off them a bit. Mortarion at his cheap points cost is a really good featured heart for the army, providing some buffs to his force nearby, and just being more tanky defense than the opponent's usually going to want to deal with in the face of all the other stuff that's happening. And allied units feel like they do quite well here, some Nurglings to screen out the midfield perhaps, and then maybe some allied war dogs, either carnivores or brigands, which can be a bit fast, dangerous and punchy, and also get some useful value out of the contagions too. Overall, they've been in a fairly strong spot in the sort of upper mid tier of Warhammer 40k for some time now. I guess for criticism, they might like their Blightlord Terminators to be a bit better. It has been strange just how much they've pushed the Death Shroud so far in 10th. It is maybe a bit odd feeling to have Plague Marines still feel weirdly not all that tough compared with being a more danger unit with their Plague weapons. And at the moment they're still waiting on their Codex to turn up to give them a few different ways to play that might come with more restricted access to Demon datasheets, I guess. Overall though, not doing too badly for Mortarions, boys. Next up, we've got the Tyranids with win rates around about 50% pre-update. The Bugs from Beyond the Galaxy have a massive range of both melee and ranged bioforms in their ranks, and their core rules are the Shadow in the Warp for a big turn of Battle Shock all over the board, potentially with -1 to that if they've got a Neuro Tyrant, and then their nearby Synapse can either make that worse or give you extra strength nearby, as well as improving leadership. The last balance changes that they had were slightly internal tweaks. They had nerfs to the Exocrine and the Tyrannifex, both really quite efficient gun bugs that tended to be in a lot of army lists, but then some helpful buffs as well to the Trigon, Hive Tyrant and the Neurolictor, all datasheets that were pretty usable already. For their detachments, a fair few of them were used in competitive play at least fairly regularly. Vanguard Onslaught with sneaky tricks and fast movement for their early invasion beasties was one of the staples. Invasion Fleets for its just good damage and defense, and damage buffs against enemy skew lists. Assimilation Swarm was helped out in the Christmas update, and that does seem to have been doing really quite well recently, with Harvesters being able to heal wounds on big monsters even when they're not on objectives, and Crusher Stampede for its advantages with monsters, which tend to be the most efficient damage dealers. After the balance passes, most of the Tyranid Codex is pretty playable in one way or another. Most armies did contain a core of monsters to deal a bunch of damage though, maybe in particular Exocrines and Tyrannifexes, so the nerfs to those will definitely sting a little bit. Maleceptors and Norn Emissaries are both common choices too, and they didn't get hit, so maybe we might see a few more of those. Hive Tyrants both on foot and on the wing are both really helpful to have around for their turns of free stratagems, and both variants are nice in the right detachment. They've got good options for lone operatives with Lictors and Death Leaper. Most lists include a Biovore to throw some Spore Mines around and score stuff, and usually makes sense to have some Endless Multitudes as well for some waves of OC2 bugs to swarm the midfield for a turn or two. Hormagaunts and Gargoyles are both really quite popular there. Each of the detachments generally encourages its own skew of unit on top of that as well. Overall still feels like Tyranids will be a solid mid to upper mid tier army. I do feel like the nerfs to the Exocrine and Tyran effects, while not being huge ones, weren't exactly helpful though, given they don't exactly have tons of units to take down tough Terminators or vehicle style targets. It would be quite nice if at some point they decide to resurrect the unending Swarm a bit. Swarm Tyranids has taken a fair few nerfs since it came out. Next up, we've got the Astra Militarum, the Guard having had a 49% win rate on the first 3 weeks after their Codex went tournament live, though that number may be inflated a little bit by the Bridgehead Strike, which took a bunch of nerfs in the latest balance pass. The Guard generally tend to operate as a big gunline shooting army, maybe some waves of chaff veterans and transports or some cavalry fighting for the midboard, and then often backed up by some big heavy hitting tanks and maybe a bit of indirect fire. The latest balance changes weren't great news for the Guard though. The Scion points went up by quite a bit, and Bridgehead got nerfed in a meaningful way, trading the +1 to wound for a +1 to hit, which doesn't synergise anywhere near as well with orders. A couple of good indirect fire points went up as well, and the Combat Engineer had its mine nerfed. In the face of all that, it feels like Bridgehead Strike isn't going to be the go-to anymore. I'd guess that people will pivot to the next most played ones as Hammer of the Emperor and Combined Regiment. I wouldn't be too surprised if the Tank Focus Guard one was one to watch with some useful enhancements and being able to move things like Tauroxes and big Rogaldorns through walls. Perhaps some more standout efficient units, I'd certainly rate the Rogaldorn tank commanders and a few of the Rust variants like the Executioner and the Battle Tank and maybe the Vanquisher as being some of the most intimidating units to fight against. Massive great big damage and defense units that are likely to beat things that they come up against in firefights. Kazakin zooming around in Tauroxes, delivering some big hitting special weapon fire with their order that they can now use out of transports are nice. Scout Sentinels are very efficient with scouting forward, providing some damage buffs and being quite tanky for the cost. Rough Riders are a nice countercharge unit. They've got a whole number of cheapish objective skirmisher type squads. Ursula Creed can chip in for a few free stratagems in certain armies, and Gaunt's Ghost can bounce on and off the board, doing secondary objectives at will. Lots of other stuff is all very usable beyond that too. Overall though, I'd still say that Guard are a really quite intimidating army to come up against. As mentioned, I suspect pivoting more towards tank damage dealers plus support. I feel like they'll certainly feel the nerfing of what felt like their best detachment before. Otherwise, for criticisms of their army though, they still do feel like there's a fair few data sheets that are either overcosted or a bit redundant compared with some others. Super heavies like the Baneblade variants just don't really compete so well against their number in Rogaldorns or Rosses. The Death Riders and Martial Dryer feel overcosted, as do a few of the more sort of utility artillery pieces that focus around debuffs now, maybe with Games Workshop's desire to try and keep indirect fire as niche as possible. Overall still pretty scary stuff for their top builds though. Next up, I've also chosen to rank the Adeptus Custodes here. Pre-update, they were 52% wins, and that one was largely being led by Solar Spearhead, the sort of dreadnoughts and tank-focused one. That went up at more like 56% or so. The Golden Guardians of the Emperor definitely have their own style of fighting though. Great big tanky stat lines with high toughness values, 2+ saves and good invulnerable saves, massive melee with Guardian Spear profiles, and their core rule revolving around that with Martial Guitar giving them sustained or lethal hits to make that yet more dangerous and general purpose. They did take some nerfs in the last balance update though. The Wardens and Blade Champions both went up by 10 points, and they were some staple units in basically every detachment, and the Solar Spearhead also had some more specific stuff as well, the best Dreadnoughts going up 10 points, and the Augury Uplink not being quite as crazy efficient as it was for the Big Feel No Pain. They did get some points cuts for Custodian Guard and Shield Captains in return though, and also a new detachment called the Lions of the Emperor. For strongest detachments now, it'll be interesting to see what emerges as the strongest Custodian one. I have a feeling that Solar Spearhead after the nerfs is going to be far more in line with the others. At least at first impressions, my guess is that Lions of the Emperor isn't going to be directly superior to Shield Host or Talons, more sort of an equivalent sort of strength. Kind of early days on that one though. Maybe it will be the new meta way to play them. For standout Custodian data sheets though, I still think Blade Champions and Wardens are going to be really quite solid. Powerful melee and speed added by the Blade Champion, and then massive defense from the Wardens, and they've got enough damage to kill things. Custodian Guard definitely narrow the gap a long way though, with their points going down. They'll certainly still be taken to the table with Kyria Draxus. Virtus Praetors and Venatari Custodians are both good fast movers. Some Sisters of Silence are generally necessary to score some objectives, maybe an allied Calidus Assassin not being the worst idea if you want some secondary objective support, and Caladius tanks will still provide some pretty nasty anti-tank fire. For any issues with the army, there's still generally going to be a faction that's a bit of a stat check army in Warhammer 40k. Can you kill enough of these Custodians or pass enough of your 4+ invulnerable saves or not? And maybe a little bit more obvious as to what they're going to do with stomping towards the mid-board objectives and trying to hold them against all comers. It certainly doesn't make them a weak army though. and still looks like they'll be on the upper end of Warhammer 40k overall. Next up, we've got the Heretic Astartes of the Chaos Space Marines. The Traitor Marines had a 48% win rate prior to the last balance update, though for that sort of middling wins, they were doing unusually well at the top levels of tournaments, taking a lot of trophies and prizes, maybe implying they're a faction that plays a bit better in the hands of the people who know how to use them absolutely inside out, as opposed to the average person putting them on the tabletop. Their core army rule are the Dark Pacts, nice extra damage whenever you shoot or fight, but at the risk of the Dark Gods taking some mortal wounds away from you. It generally favours the army playing fairly aggressively and taking big chunks out of the foe before they get too hit back. The balance changes had a few small tweaks. Forge Fiends went down a bit, Predator Annihilators went up a bit, and Lord Discordant went down but not enough to make him good, and I guess a few changes to Allied Demon datasheets that they could choose to add in. For strong detachments, it doesn't really feel like it's going to change too much. Creations of Bile has generally been the most played, and seemingly the one with the most success for a little while now, favouring some melee rush Chaos Space Marines, which is all rather good fun. They quite like their Possessed and a few other fighty datasheets. Otherwise, Renegade Raiders with its extra AP, extra speed and transport tactics is nice, and Pact-bound Zealots with the big extra mark buffs. That's maybe another one of the more standout, popular and scary ones. Again, like plenty of armies that have had several balance passes, most of the Chaos Space Marine units are at least fairly usable. Maybe some standouts will be things like the Chaos Lord with Chosen or Legionaries jumping out of Rhinos to hit stuff hard. It's usually worth having some Cultists along for really cheap action and objective units with sticky objectives on the go. Plenty of armies take at least some scary firepower with things like Predator Destructors or Vindicators both being quite nice, particularly with sustained hits. Cypher's a particularly dangerous lone operative that can really jump on a medium infantry squad and hit it very hard with that plasma pistol. Otherwise there's lots of interesting units like Bikes, Raptors, Warp Talons, Possessed, for sort of more skirmishing, smaller style units, or with their own perks and pros and cons. Fabius Biles also pretty auto-include in the creations as well, to allow you to re-roll the detachment rule. Overall fairly good stuff for the Chaos Space Marines though, most datasheets usable, and a few of the detachments playable. I do feel like maybe one of the armies that it would be quite nice to have some rules changes for some of the lesser played stuff. Things like Deceptors or the Dread Talons are kind of rarely seen on the table. And with big damage punches and valuable units, you might have to make some big decisions as to where things commit or don't, and not waste your Heretic Astartes elites on inferior targets. Next up, we've got 40k Space Dwarves and the Leagues of Votann, win rates around about 50%, and the kin have their Judgment tokens as their core mechanic, marking units that do them wrong for +1 to hit and wound, their Oathband being able to mark 4 units at the start at 2,000 point games, and otherwise their units tend to have at least fairly high toughness characteristics, and maybe be a little bit shorter ranged compared with some in 40k. The last balance update didn't really do too much meaningful for them, basically helping out their Hearthband Grotmus detachment by giving that a little bit of the double Judgment token love. Until this point at least though, basically everyone's been playing the Oathband if they've been trying to make a strong Leagues of Votann army. The extra Judgment definitely helps out quite a lot as of that big command point reward, and I've got some fairly powerful damage and defense stratagems like sustained hits, returning fire, void armor, and a few more bits of good stuff. The army's got really quite a small roster at the moment, given that they're a new and slightly undeveloped faction for 40k so far. Oathband lists do feel like they've been at least a little bit convergent recently, almost everything having a good core of Sagittars, with maybe something like between 3 and 6 of those, Hearthkin Warriors and Chthonian Berserks hitching a ride there, usually around something like a pair of Land Fortresses with Conversion Beamers at 2k, maybe with some Hearthguard inside them perhaps. Hernkin Pioneers are popular, usually there's at least some Hernkin Jaegers to take the midfield to make sure that things can do their scout moves, though pretty much every single datasheet is at least fairly usable. I feel like lists tend to de-emphasise the characters a bit though in Leagues of Votann compared with some. Overall, they're a pretty effective and fairly well balanced Warhammer 40k army at the moment. Their army does tend to be maybe fairly straightforward in terms of damage and defense Warhammer 40k, as opposed to having big sneaky tricks to get unusual advantages over the enemy though. The unit pool is a bit restricted, so you don't have as many things to cover every single battlefield role, and I feel like the 2+ save units, particularly the Einhir Hearthguard, were hurt by the Armour of Contempt's change, maybe making them a bit less reliably indomitable against lots of shooting. Overall still look like they're in a very good place though. Next up we have Khorne's Chosen Space Marines with the World Eaters. Pre-update win rates are around about 49%, again really quite nicely balanced there. They're basically an entire army of melee psychos with chain axes running at you very fast, and their core mechanic otherwise are the Blessings of Khorne, rolling the dice, and being given scary melee damage buffs, defense things, or extra speed boosts. The last balance update gave them some points drops to the Demon Princes and also the Juggernaut Lord, and fairly meaningful and substantial ones to both of those. For detachment choice, their more Index 1 and Grotmus Detachment 1 both have a fair bit of interest and success. It still looks like more people play the Berserker warbands, lots of good melee support stratagems there, and just extra damage when charging in doesn't hurt either, though good numbers also take the sort of character and champion focused Vessels of Wrath too. It feels like that one might get a bit of a lift in particular from Demon Princes being that bit cheaper. They felt like they had a better home there than in the Berserker warbands. They really don't have all that many model kits, though most of their unique stuff is really quite usable. Angrons basically auto-include in Berserker warbands, and plenty of Vessels of Wrath lists choose to use him too. 8-bound of both flavours are really nice elite melee damage dealers. Lord Invocators can be used to scout exalted ones if it makes sense to. Berserkers in a Rhino can be handy to have alongside a Master of Executions for another second punch unit. Lists tend to not go too heavy on those though. Maybe having objectives and expendable things done by Jackals or Spawn as ways for expendable units that you don't necessarily need to worry about the deaths of quite so much. For army weaknesses or criticisms, I guess maybe Khan the Betrayer could probably use a small points cut. He feels a bit on the pricey side for what he does, and I still think that the Master of Executions is a bit expensive too. I feel like with those two being a bit pricey, that's one of the reasons why Khorne Berserkers don't have quite as much of a focus compared with other stuff. I feel like it wouldn't be awful to have a bit more emphasis on the rank and file of the Blood God. Otherwise, I guess they have their usual strengths and weaknesses. They are a slightly monodimensional for melee army, but that's kind of the point of them. They should likely be getting a whole bunch of new content and interesting stuff with their upcoming codex. Finally, for armies that have ranked in this tier, we've got the Emperor's Children. Games Workshop's released their codex in the Champions box set, and they've got some interim points costs, but they aren't recommended for tournaments and things like that yet, and really quite a lot of their model range isn't on sale yet either. Probably won't be too long before that happens though. For their army rule, they have their core mechanic of their advanced shoot and charge and fall back shoot and charge, but with some limitations that they can't do boring things like re-engage the same enemy, and they tend to have quite fast movement stats across the army more generally. For the detachments at the moment, I'm genuinely kind of interested as to what armies people are going to play with most. At first impressions, it feels like there's some genuine interest to a good bunch of them. Peerless Bladesman for easy melee damage, Mercurial Host for helpful speed, the Coterie of the Conceited for some nice stacking buffs, and the Transport Detachment looks like maybe one of the best ones for scary noise marine fire. Will be fun to see what people choose to put on the table when it actually comes to tournament play. For unit profiles, most of the units in the book also seem usable, only a few feel really truly less good, like maybe the Sorcerer and the Helldrake. For particularly standout stuff, the battle line things seem great, Tormentors seem just great objective support, Infractors look like a terrifying melee threat alongside a big hitting Lord Exultant. Noise Marines have got pretty helpful general purpose firepower, and their Spawn and Rhinos both feel like they're exceptionally good versions of them compared with the other Chaos Legions and 40k in general. Demon Princes, particularly the winged ones, look fun, lots of big hitting impact hits, and they work well with a few detachments, and Mauler Fiends move fast here and hit hard with some scary damage profiles. From initial reactions to the codex, it seems like maybe the Flawless Blades and Fulgrim are the ones that people are less certain of, currently looking a little bit underwhelmed by their points cost. For weaknesses of the army, they've certainly got speeds down, though I feel like it is going to be quite painful whenever their rather expensive units are out in the open and just getting shot by a bunch of damage. Most stuff really isn't all that tough for the cost, as you might expect for Slaanesh, and while most units can do a fair bit of damage to tough stuff like tanks and monsters, there's maybe only a few things that really feel truly good at it, and a lot of it feels like it needs to get into melee to be able to do so, and it could be some slightly painful times for them if they do get screened out. In a case a bit speculative as to where they'd rank at the moment, I'd probably rank around about here, or maybe a little bit lower than this at first impressions. I guess hopefully it won't be too much longer before the big release happens though, and people start to put Fulgrim and friends on the table. Finally, we get to the tier 1 armies and the one army that I've chosen to rank just above them. For these ones, I wouldn't necessarily say that they're absolutely clearly better than the ones in tier 2, but maybe just feel a touch more standout. And I suspect that some of these in their scariest forms are going to be seriously intimidating things that are hard to beat in 40k in general. Here I've chosen to rank Chaos Demons, Imperial Knights, Deathwatch, Aeldari and Space Marines. In the last two, maybe with respect to their sub-factions, in particularly Inari Aeldari and Ultramarine Space Marines here. Going through these, and first up we have Chaos Demons. They feel like they're a faction that's been more or less turned on their head over the last balance update. Previously they had 56% win rates and a good argument to being the single strongest army in the game. That was due to Legion of Excess. Slaaneshi demons with access to massive amounts of damage, who in the balance updates that got very heavily nerfed. A bunch of data sheets got either better or worse, though I feel like there was enough interesting stuff that got significantly better, and also they gained a rather great new detachment as well in the Shadow Legion. The Chaos Demons in general certainly play 40k very differently, every unit having deep strike, mostly relying on invulnerable saves as opposed to armor saves with their otherworldly protection. The core rule is the Shadow of Chaos, for hurting fearful mortals and strengthening themselves in areas of board control, and then each one of the Chaos deities come with its own rule themes, Khorne being scary in combat, Slaanesh being extra fast, Tzeentch doing ranged things and having good invulnerable saves, and Nurgle having sheer toughness. For their detachments, while the Legion of Excess has been nerfed really quite hard, I'd guess that both Demon Incursion and Shadow Legion will probably be doing quite well. The Shadow Legion's really quite fun with its different deity buffs. Tzeentch and Nurgle get extra tanky, Khorne gets to move extra fast and hit things, and then you get access to far more Chaos Space Marine datasheets on top of that as well. Plus there's some good enhancements for things like scout moves and then returning to reserves after you've destroyed something. The Demon Incursion is still really powerful though with its reserve manipulation. Being able to set up 6-inch charges is just not something that 40k armies can do that well in general, never mind just doing it for one command point anywhere on the board. Plus get some great enhancements where the greater demons get the boosted version all the time, and some alright stratagem support as well. After the datasheet updates, there still feels like there's a bunch of standout stuff. Nurgling's got a worse debuff rule, but they're fairly godly at screening. Looks like they could be weirdly hard to kill if you put loads of bases and just flood the board with them and pin back the enemy army early. Playbearers are nice for their sticky objectives and toughness, pretty hard to fight in the Nurgle detachment. Beasts gain Scout on already being a good datasheet before, and the Great Unclean One and Rottagus both seem to be extra intimidating and tanky. The Great Unclean One's buff effectively going to Toughness 13, and also getting fightier melee was pretty good and probably worth the extra 20 points. For Tzeentch, Screamers and Flamers both got cheaper, the Lord of Change is a reasonable datasheet too. Bloodthirsters still all very fighty for the Khorne demons, Scarbrand can advance and charge now, Fleshhounds can jump on and off the board, so a good secondary unit all of a sudden, and Blood Crushers can still bring the raw melee damage from close deep strike charges in the Demon Incursion. It feels like the Slaanesh demons maybe had the rougher end of the changes than points things, maybe in reaction to Legion of Excess, and Be'lakor might have gone up in points quite a bit, but he is also really quite fighty now. And in the Shadow Legion he can gain Dark Pats as well, so is a scarier prospect there. Overall, between all that, I suspect that between Demon Incursion and the Shadow Legion, they're still going to be towards the upper end of Warhammer 40k in tournament performance, even without the massive buffs of the Legion of Excess. Probably their biggest issues as a 40k army right now, and their sort of weird uncertain state. Feels likely that we might get some more revisions to the Demon Index after the Deity Legion codexes come out. Hopefully they don't send too many more things to Legends. The Imperial Knights are 40k's big army of stompy robot walkers, and they've been doing incredibly well prior to the balance update, around about 54% wins. As ever, Knights generally tends to be even better at the more casual or small tournament sort of level as opposed to grand tournament things, though they were winning some GTs, and it looks like they already have won a grand tournament post-update as well. As for the Chaos Knights, they're a whole army of big stompy robot walkers, massive firepower and big stat lines. The big Knights can walk straight through ruined walls and things. And for their core mechanics, they get some inbuilt big rerolls that can mean that they're very good anti-tank damage. They get a Feel No Pain type save, and if they can destroy the enemy warlord, they can get a big command point bonus and better Feel No Pain. For the latest balance changes, for some reason Games Workshop just gave them a slight buff. Castellan Knights going down to 480 points, and an Allied Collectors dropping down to 85 points if you want one. Castellans felt like they were one of the more usable knights, even if they weren't the most single standout one, and it looks like that winning tournament list already used a cheaper Collectors, so at least some interest there I suppose. Until their codex comes out, they've only got the 2 detachments, and people use the Noble Lance because the Allied Admech one for Grotmus just wasn't really very good. Rotate Iron Shields on its own is quite good, and they've got a very nice shooting stratagem that can help out Helverins in a big way. In general at the moment it does seem like the real stars of the Imperial Knight Codex are the little guys. Both Armiger Warglaves and Armiger Helverins are just weirdly cheap right now at 130 points and 140, so lots of lists tend to be just going very very heavy, maybe with one Titanic Knight such as Canis Rex, though some lists take 2, or choose other things to lead them into battle. In general they also tend to use some allies as well, a Calatus Assassin may be the single most popular thing, otherwise perhaps some Chaff Infantry or maybe some Sisters in an Immolator. Overall looks like they'll be in a really quite good spot going forward. They were doing pretty great before, and now quite a lot of their rivals have got nerfed in one way or another where they've only got a small buff. They do still have their usual downsides, being a bit more predictable. Maybe their armigers en masse can be a bit easier to move, block and screen. They could have some fairly disastrous things if something pins them in their deployment zone. I do sort of feel like they might be getting a little bit like Chaos Knights have been, with over-focusing on the armigers, rather than having big knights being the more centrepiece of the army as they have been previously. In any case, will be some chance for a change around in the not too distant future though, given that their codex is expected sometime, probably in summertime, from Games Workshop's teasers. Next up, we've got the Deathwatch, the black-clad operatives of the Ordo Xenos, and pre-update they also seem to be riding rather high as well, win rates of 54%, and doing quite well for high placings or victories at tournaments given really quite a small player base. They get the Space Marine Oath of Moment, and then they use their Black Spear Task Force to get their mission tactic buffs for their kill teams, getting lethal hits or sustained hits on different turns, being able to flex into them and teleport units around, and they've got some fun special issue ammo stratagems for when they need to hit a given target extra hard. In the last balance update, Games Workshop weren't really too harsh to them either. Their Terminator small squads went up by a little bit, a fair bunch of Space Marine fire support went up a touch, but generally Deathwatch armies tended to have more focus on their kill team style units given the detachment rules, and Devastator Centurions dropped by a fairly good amount, down to 330 points for a big squad, and they're quite a relevant unit to the Deathwatch given that you can use the Teleportarium stratagem to warp that scary firepower exactly where you need it. Their Black Spear detachment's really quite a strong one. On top of the stratagems as mentioned, they also have the Tome of Ectoclades for a double Oath of Moment. The Beacon Angelus is good, and the Thief of Secrets can make something like a Judas Ear or Watchmaster extra fighty, and then lists have been building around their kill teams. Generally it's the Deathwatch veterans, the Terminator squads, Indomitor kill teams, and Talon Strike ones that tends to get the most focus. All big threatening units in their own way that are great for the focal stratagems that you can use on them. The relevant ones being led by various flavours of captains, lieutenants, Judas Ears, or watchmasters. Beyond that, Space Marines have got lots of support options, quite a lot of things with nice datasheet rules that you can add in to help them out. Overall, the nerfs haven't really hit them too hard, given that they were doing quite well before. I guess for issues to the army, it would be quite nice to have the Corvus Blackstar actually be made good, though that seems kind of unlikely with Games Workshop's dislike of aircraft being strong in 10th. And the army does feel like it's in a bit of a weird place in general, surviving through a sort of patched digital update, where there has to be some sort of concern as to whether or not they change them massively or redesign the faction in a big way in a future edition. They're certainly doing well on the tabletop at the moment though. Next up we've got the Aeldari, and perhaps for the reason that they're up here as opposed to more in the second tier, are the Inari specifically, so the Death Cult Aeldari led by Evrain or the Incarn, with their devoted of Ennead detachment. Pre-update, they had win rates of around about 52%, but that's based on just a few weeks of data, and it seems that the Inari detachment was far outperforming that, and it does also seem to have done very, very well in the few tournaments that have already played following the balance update. Looks like 6 lists went 4 wins to 1 loss last weekend. Pretty mad representation for the top tables for any one detachment. For their core themes, the Aeldari move fast and double down on that with their battle focus movement tricks, a few power boosts, things like certain interesting reactive style moves, denying overwatch or just flat out going faster. And in the latest balance update that they had points increases to several of their Aspect Warriors and Wave Serpents, and it has definitely hit some staples to the point where they won't be quite as strong as they were before, though do seem to be a bit more squarely aimed at Aspect Host as opposed to the Inari. Warhost and Aspect Host still seem good, though I'd still say that the Devoted of Ennead looks like it's the single most standout one. It just has a bunch of fairly game-changing tricks. Moving a unit around after the enemy shooting phase is a really powerful time to be able to do that, basically stopping charges or setting up for massive damage in the next turn. Surprise fights first or jumping into melee at the wrong time can be nasty, as could the odd surprise burst of shooting, and they do have some other interesting stuff like damage stratagems. At the heart of that, there'll often be Evrain plus some Incubi for some very scary general purpose melee, maybe with the Vizark along for fights first. The Incarn's also very strong. People seemed a bit mid when the Codex came out, but it also went down in points quite a lot, and I think people hadn't quite computed that at the time. And despite some points increases, a bunch of Aspect Warriors still seem to be really quite focally in the vast majority of army lists. Fire Dragons for anti-tank, Warp Spiders jumping around doing secondaries and slaying infantry, Howling Banshees for some anti-infantry melee duties, and Dark Reapers now maybe more commonly in units of 5 than 10 given the points differential. Striking Scorpions are great to skirmish for the midfield, even if they've gone up a touch. Wraithlords are strong datasheets, maybe seen in Inari a bit more so than say Aspect Host, and Wave Serpents could be good for some of the Aspect Warriors, though maybe a little bit more so in Aspect Host and Warhost with the re-embark stratagems than Inari. The Phoenix Lords are also great if you're not going with the Death Cult Eldar. Aeldari certainly have some weaknesses, with most of the units being really quite fragile. Heavy aspect warrior foot dialists won't enjoy things that could say hit them out of line of sight, like Chaos Knight Wardog Havoc launchers, or things with 6-inch deep strikes that could maybe get unusual lines of sight and kill a bunch. And particularly with battle focused things, they feel like quite a high skill army, an absolute ton of options, but you need to spot the most painful ones for the opponent, or the ones that can most deliver victory in the game overall. Finally, for armies in this tier, we've got the boys in blue for the Space Marines, and as mentioned for the rating on this list, for Ultramarines specifically, I suspect non-Ultramarine Space Marine list would be a good tier or two lower. Pre-update Space Marines were looking rather balanced on the win rate kind of front, 50% win rates, but it does kind of obscure the fact that Ultramarines were doing kind of great and everything else less so, and Space Marines have certainly been taking a massive amount of top tournament places, outright event wins and high placings, disproportionate even for the amount of people playing them. For their core rule, they get Oath of Moment to mark one target for extra damage, but for core Marines they also get +1 to wound as well. So basically against Space Marine armies, any one unit is going to be able to have enormous amounts of damage stacked against it. So super good against armies that have big tanky units that just want to eat a lot of damage and stand in the open. As we mentioned, for a few of the armies, they had nerfs to several fire support units, Vindicators, Ballistas, Dreadnoughts and Predator tanks. Marnie's Calgar and his favourite company heroes both went up 10 points. They broke the combo of repeatedly deep striking Centurions with Uriel Ventris, though put down Centurions in points as a result. The Stormlance Task Force had its reactive moves no longer being able to be used on Dreadnoughts or Primarchs, though they did have a couple of buffs, as well as the Devastator Centurions having cheaper Blade Guard veterans, and also Fire Discipline improving a bit for Gladius. Overall, between all that, it was certainly more nerfs than buffs, but at the same time they don't really feel like they fundamentally made the strongest thing about the army quite as weak, which is things like Guilliman with extra stratagems and double Oath of Moment, commanding a whole bunch of Space Marine firepower. He can still very much do that, and there's lots of other data sheets that do it really well. For their detachments, the most played tended to be Gladius, Vanguard and Ironstorm. Gladius for its flexible combat doctrines and damage buffs, Vanguard for some sneaky tricks and previously teleporting Centurions around, which won't happen quite as easily anymore, and Ironstorm often with Guilliman helping out batteries of Dreadnoughts and tanks. Feels like after the changes Gladius might have been the bigger winner out of those. Maybe we'll see a few more lists skewing that way. For standout units besides Guilliman himself with his big stratagems and double Oath, Space Marines have lots of useful units, lots of support things with Scouts for taking the midboard, Infiltrators for screening deep strike, Intercessors for sticky objectives and some big anti-horde, Incursors with a nice bit of scrappy melee plus boosting firepower at the same time, and Jump Intercessors for being cheap deep strikers with a bit of melee threat. After the increases to Ballistas and the Vindicator, it feels like the tanks are a bit more balanced, quite a lot of solidly efficient options there. Storm Speeder Hammer Strikes often tend to be popular to ignore cover for a big Space Marine gun battery. Combi Lieutenants are a fairly popular lone operative, potentially quite safely triggering the Primarch's lone operative style rule, and also just being really disruptive and annoying to get to grips with. And then different damage combos varying a bit depending on detachment or chapter, based on stratagems and enhancements and detachment rules and things. For issues for them, it does feel like they did take some nerfs to some of their best stuff. It feels like they will be a bit weaker than before, and the same Ultramarines list with loads of Vindicators and Ballistas Dreadnoughts would now cost a fair few more points to put on the table. Still looks like they're going to be a scary army overall though. Maybe one of their biggest issues being the balance between Ultramarines and the other chapters out there that don't have Guilliman amplifying their force. Given how auto-include he is, maybe the more obvious thing might have been to increase Guilliman's points cost and then lower the points cost on some other things to try and make the army a bit more strong even if he's not there, and make him a bit more of a maybe choice. Feels like he'd be cropping up in most Space Marine lists until that point though. Finally, last but by no means least, we've come to the one army of ranked above the rest, and as you might guess, in the S tier we've got Orks, and it's specifically Orks that have really found a whole load of Dakka in the pile of guns. In first place have ranked Orks, and specifically more Dakka Orks, with the rest of the army outside of that one crazy detachment being fairly well balanced. Pre-update Orky win rates were around about 50%, the biggest success for them being Tactical Brigade, which got nerfed in a couple of different ways. A few focal units went up a bit, but now it can only do one of its 2 tactics rather than 2 of them, and also the best enhancement went up a touch as well. At the same time though, Games Workshop decided to give the Orks the more Dakka detachment, which basically means Orc shooting but way better, and it seems that that's off to a flying start. Already having won a grand tournament and a couple of other high placings, I suspect that it's probably the first of many until Games Workshop decides to tone it down. Just at base, Orks have some fun core rules with a massive boost on the turn of the war, making their melee far scarier, and also giving some army-wide invulnerable saves, likely around about turn 2 or thereabouts. and the units tend to be fairly good at bullying things in melee and being fairly scary and aggressive in playstyle. To add into that, more Dakka gives you sustained hits 2 on all Orc shooting for their infantry and walker datasheets, which gives you a crazy basically flat double damage if you were hitting on a 5 before. So it makes tank busters and looters just seriously next level damage threats. Squads of them that are around about 100 to 135 points can be seriously threatening to kill their points cost of most targets in the game if they get a round of shooting off, even without any other buffs. They do have access to Ignore's cover and an extra AP boost as 2 relatively easy stratagems, plus an enhancement to give you a +1 to hit as well. But the other really crazy thing about the detachment is that there's a 1 command point war stratagem to make 1 unit advance and shoot, advance and charge, +1 strength, +1 attack, a 5+ invulnerable save, and then any datasheet rules such as Zogrod Wartsnagger's extra movement or the Meganob's 5+ feel no pain, making it probably the single most valuable 1 command point stratagem in the whole game. There's even 1 forward reroll wound rolls in melee against objective markers, making the theoretically shooty detachment punch really hard too. As a result, those sort of lists are going to be based around looters and tank busters, just delivering obscene amounts of damage, led by some shock attack gun mechs, likely with some trucks or battle wagons to get them there, and then dedicate the rest of the list to grabbing all the objective points that you can. Easy to use Gretchen and Storm Boys for objective things. Zogrod Wartsnagger, who can flood the board with Gretchen right from turn 1, and maybe move block a whole chunk of the enemy army straight away on a good day. And maybe some units that are extra nice for using the war stratagem on, maybe Ghazghkull Thraka and a unit of Meganobs or something different. Overall, just for its sheer raw power, I suspect that it's going to be the single strongest army in Warhammer 40k until Games Workshop decide to nerf it. There's just certainly not anything else in the game that really delivers this amount of Dakka this reliably. Otherwise, beyond that, I feel like the other Orc detachments are at least fairly well balanced, maybe Warhorde being one of the most notable ones after the nerfs to Tactical Brigade. Hopefully there's still enough interest in Tactical to still make it playable though. Feels like the single biggest weakness for the more Dakka thing is that it just seems inevitable that it's probably going to get nerfed sooner or later, and then when it does, that's really the only thing that's making Orcs in this sort of tier as opposed to a bit lower. It still does feel like there's some counterplay to the detachment as well. I feel like it'd be pretty oppressive with a good list played well against most opponents, maybe being a little bit less effective against armies that want to play a sort of guerrilla warfare sort of playstyle with lots of lone operatives or hiding behind terrain, maybe frustrating the green skin damage a bit. And then if they do have to expose their units, they aren't really actually all that tough and a lot of them can't fall back and shoot. So there might be a few ways to try and manage them, even if it does feel like the Orcs have their leg up in most fights here. That just about brings us to the end of this one though. Let me know your thoughts as to the 40k armies down in the comments below. Which ones do you reckon are going to be on top or not post-update? And would you agree with the ratings here, or would you have rated anything higher or lower? Look forward to hearing your thoughts down in the comments. Before I go though, I'll just cycle back to today's video sponsor in Tabletop Stronghold, just to talk through their mag case range a little bit for anyone interested in their carry cases. Here's roughly how many miniatures that you can fit on each layers of their magnetic cases, around about 90 odd guardsman equivalents or 30 terminators or so, quite a bit of room if they're all ranked up. And then for the different mag cases, they've got different sort of sizes and heights of them. The mini one is more of a skirmish one, but can still fit some big tanks in. They're around £72 or $75 when they're on sale. They have free shipping around the world, but there might be some VAT or import duties to pay. For the regular mag case, that one's a fair bit taller, as you can see by the Chaos Knight on the bottom floor of this one. This one's $120, and I'll leave the dimensions of it on the screen. And then here's the really big one in the mag case XL, basically 2 of the previous put together, and you can see that acrylic screen on the front there. They do also have some MDF terrain in their competitive terrain set as well. Could be worth checking out, as they've got some bundle deals of that a bit cheaper if you happen to pick up one of the mag cases. Certainly one of the more tried and tested ways of getting an entire table of 40k terrain on the go for cheap. In any case, there'll be links down in the video description below, and a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. I'll leave that there for now though. If you'd like to see more like this, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and I tend to have new ones out every day. Check out the links down in the video description, including the discount retailers and the channel's Patreon page if you'd like to help support and keep the videos coming. But otherwise, just an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.